You know how it is you want to understand something complex, maybe, without getting totally lost in a mountain of data?
Right.
Well, you've definitely come to the right place today.
Yeah.
We're doing a deep dive into the financial world of the 2020 Democratic presidential primary.
Yeah, it's a fascinating area.
We've got this really interesting report that pulls back the curtain on where the top 5 candidates got their money and, just as importantly, where it all went.
Exactly. And we're not going to get bogged down in like endless spreadsheets or anything.
No.
But we are going to unpack the crucial insights into how these campaigns were bankrolled and what that tells us about their strategic choices and ultimately their path through that primary.
So our mission today really is to understand the financial strategies. We're talking Biden, Sanders, Warren, Bloomberg, and Buttigieg.
Main players, yeah.
We're going to look at who was funding them, how they were spending those resources, and critically, how all that connects to how they actually, fared in that pivotal primary contest.
And it's so crucial to keep in mind the sheer scale here. The financial activity in 2020, or the entire election cycle, set records. Something near $13 billion in total spending.
Wow. $14 billion.
Yeah. And the presidential race alone.
Yeah.
Estimated $6.6 billion.
Yeah.
And the Democratic primary itself was also just breaking new financial ground.
Absolutely. You had this really charged political atmosphere, right? A bunch of closely fought races. And these really interesting new ways of fundraising emerging. The growing power of small dollar donors alongside, the unprecedented self-funding of someone like Bloomberg.
Right, that really shook things off.
Created this really unique and, frankly, high-stakes financial landscape.
Which brings us, to our 5 key candidates.
Yeah.
You had Joe Biden, who, as the eventual nominee, really leveraged his deep connections within the Democratic establishment.
The establishment support, sure.
Then you had Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. They built these incredibly impressive grassroots movements, really powered by individual, often quite small contributions.
That small dollar army.
Exactly. Pete Buttigieg, he seemed to be navigating maybe a middle ground, attracting both smaller and larger donations.
Of a blend.
Blend, yeah. And then, of course, you had Michael Bloomberg, who took this entirely different route, just trying to spend his own vast fortune to secure the nomination.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Maybe start by looking at the overall financial firepower. Like, how much money did their official campaign committees actually manage to raise in total?
Okay, yeah. Looking at the total funds raised, the numbers really paint a picture of, different financial tiers. Michael Bloomberg just tops the list by a significant margin. A staggering $1,096,324,411.
It's over $1 billion.
Over $1 billion. Second is Joe Biden, also crossing that $1 billion threshold at $1,044,187,828.
Okay, so 2 in the billion club.
Right. Then we see a pretty considerable drop. Bernie Sanders at $211,125,958.
Still a lot, but yeah, big drop.
Followed by Elizabeth Warren with $126,979,639. And Pete Buttigieg rounding out that top 5 with $99,925,342 too, just under $100 million.
Wow, okay. So Bloomberg and Biden were just operating on a completely different financial plane compared to Sanders, Warren, and Buttigieg, at least in terms of the total cash their committees brought in.
Absolutely. Different leagues entirely based on those totals.
And it's interesting that Biden, even though he came in second in overall fundraising by his committee, he really saw a surge in financial support later in the game, right? Especially after he started, racking up those primary wins.
Precisely. His fundraising in the lead up to the general election contributed significantly to that final $1 billion total.
Right. That makes sense.
But even if we just focus on the primary period itself, those distinct financial tiers, they're quite evident. And what's truly fascinating here, and maybe a bit of foreshadowing, is that Bloomberg, despite having this enormous financial advantage, he didn't win the nomination.
Right.
Which really underscores the point, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Simply having the most money doesn't guarantee victory.
It definitely doesn't. Which naturally leads us to the question of, okay, where did all that money actually go? How much did each of these campaigns end up spending?
Well, the spending figures largely align with those fundraising totals, as you might, expect.
Okay.
Bloomberg spent almost exactly what he raised, $1,096,211,245, just slightly less than he brought in.
Practically dollar for dollar.
Pretty much. Biden wasn't far behind in spending either. $1,042,748,801.
Also huge.
Then Sanders spent $205,449,970 totals. Warren, $126,855,215. And Buttigieg, $93,915,174.
So, okay, there's a pretty clear connection between how much they brought in and how much they spent, roughly.
Generally, yes.
But the real story, I imagine, lies in how they managed to raise those funds in the first place, the different models, and then crucially, where did they choose to invest those dollars? What were the priorities?
Absolutely. This is where we get into the really fascinating differences in their fundraising models. We saw a real spectrum of approaches.
Like what?
Well, from the strong grassroots focus of Sanders and Warren to the more, maybe, traditional reliance on high-dollar donors by Biden and Buttigieg.
Right.
And then, of course, Bloomberg's very unique strategy of, well, largely funding his own campaign.
Let's dive into that grassroots power first, then Sanders and Warren. They both really emphasized getting lots and lots of small contributions from individual people, didn't they?
They did indeed. That was core to their message. For Bernie Sanders, over 53% of his total campaign funds, that's more than $114.8 million, came from small dollar donors.
Wow, over half.
Yeah, meaning individual contributions of under $200. And just to put that in perspective, like in the first quarter of 2019 alone, he raised $18.2 million. Nearly $15.3 million of that came from these small individual donations.
That's incredible early energy.
It really was. And Elizabeth Warren's numbers tell a similar story. Almost 52% of her funds, totaling about $66.5 million, originated from small dollar contributions.
Pretty close to Sanders percentage-wise.
Very close. And she even made a deliberate choice early in her campaign, remember, to avoid those traditional high-dollar fundraising events.
Right. I remember that being a really significant part of her early campaign narrative. It set her apart.
It did.
And it's quite remarkable how much they were able to raise through these smaller individual donations.
Well, what's truly insightful here is that their success really reflects a broader trend we're seeing in campaign finance.
How so?
In the 2020 cycle, small dollar donations accounted for 22% of all federal money raised.
22% overall.
Which is a significant jump from the 15% we saw back in 2016.
Okay, so it's a growing force.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And platforms like ActBlue have really played a crucial role in, facilitating this type of fundraising, making it easier for people to chip in small amounts.
Right, the technology helps.
But, as the report points out, there's a trade-off with this model. You need to maintain a really high level of engagement. You need a very active base of supporters to keep that consistent flow of small donations coming in. It takes constant effort.
Constant stoking of the fires, yeah. Now, on the other end of that fundraising spectrum, we have Biden and Buttigieg, who seem to rely more heavily on those larger individual contributions, the max-out donors and so on.
Exactly. For Joe Biden, over 61% of his campaign committee's funds, a massive $646 million, came from large individual donations, those over $200.
So the majority for him.
The clear majority. Small dollar donations still made up a significant portion, though, around 38% or about $406.6 million.
Still substantial, yeah.
And as we touched on earlier, his fundraising really gained momentum after his victory in South Carolina. That win unlocked a lot of donor enthusiasm.
Things changed quickly, though.
Very quickly. And Pete Buttigieg also relied significantly on large donors. Nearly 57% of his funds, approximately $57.7 million, came from that source.
Okay.
Interestingly, he had a very successful early fundraising period. He actually led all the candidates in terms of money raised in the second quarter of 2019.
That's right. I remember that, Buzz. And we saw the sectors where Buttigieg drew a lot of his support, didn't we? Like finance, major tech companies, Alphabet, Microsoft were mentioned, real estate, entertainment.
Yeah, the report lists those.
It paints a picture of a more traditional, perhaps more establishment-leaning fundraising base compared to Sanders or Warren.
It does seem that way. Relying on these established high-dollar networks is, well, a more conventional fundraising path.
Yeah.
And the report suggests that the commitment from these donors can really solidify, even increase, when a candidate is perceived as having a strong chance of winning the nomination.
So electability becomes a factor for them.
Right. These donors might be seen as making more, perhaps, strategic calculations in their political giving.
Okay. And then we have Michael Bloomberg, who was just really in a financial category all his own, a complete outlier.
Absolutely. His candidacy was essentially an unprecedented experiment in self-funding, just unlike anything we'd really seen at that scale before.
Right.
He entered the race relatively late, remember, November 2019, focused heavily on Super Tuesday, and almost entirely financed his campaign himself.
Okay, so what are the numbers on that self-funding?
Out of that staggering $1.096 billion his campaign raised, an astonishing 99.35%, that's $1.089 billion, came directly from his personal wealth.
99.35%.
Wow. Yeah. And he even initially stated he wouldn't accept outside contributions at all.
That is just an almost unimaginable level of personal financial investment in a campaign. And I remember seeing reports about how much he was spending every single day in the run-up to Super Tuesday. It was, well, an eye-watering amount.
Right. The report mentions an average daily spending figure of around $5.9 million through January 2020.
5.9 million a day.
A day. But, as we all know, despite that massive, massive outlay, it just didn't translate into significant electoral success.
Yeah.
He won only American Samoa, which really, really drives home the point that even with virtually unlimited personal funds, you just can't simply buy a presidential nomination.
Money isn't everything, clearly. And there was some controversy surrounding his spending even after he decided to end his campaign, wasn't there? Something about a transfer.
Yes, exactly. The transfer of $18 million to the Democratic National Committee after he dropped out certainly raised some eyebrows.
Right.
And it was quickly labeled the Bloomberg loophole by some observers and critics.
Why a loophole?
Well, the criticism was that it essentially allowed him to bypass the normal individual contribution limits by funneling a large sum of his personal wealth to the party after he was no longer technically a candidate himself.
Okay, I see the argument.
And the report also touches on the idea that his sheer volume of advertising spending likely drove up the costs for the other campaigns, too. They had to spend more just to get their messages heard over the noise.
Made the whole environment more expensive.
Plausibly, yes. But ultimately, the key takeaway from the Bloomberg experiment is that even with that unprecedented level of spending, he couldn't overcome the other crucial factors. Winning over voters, building trust, securing the nomination.
Okay. Now, the report also delves into another big money factor, the significant role played by outside money, specifically political action committees and super PACs.
Right.
And it's kind of interesting because criticizing big money in politics is often a theme for Democratic candidates, but these groups still had a considerable impact, didn't they?
They did indeed, particularly in the case of Joe Biden. Super PACs, or independent expenditure-only committees, as they're formally known.
Right.
They have the ability to raise and spend unlimited amounts of money, the key rule being they can't directly coordinate their activities with the candidate's official campaign.
The independence rule.
Exactly. And despite that general criticism of big money, pro-Biden super PACs were quite active, especially, perhaps crucially, during periods when his campaign's own fundraising might have been facing challenges, particularly before that South Carolina primary win.
So they provided cover when maybe the campaign was low on funds.
That's the argument, yes.
Yeah.
They kept his message out there.
Can you give us a sense of the scale of this outside spending and maybe some of the key pro-Biden super PACs involved?
Certainly. One of the early ones mentioned is Unite the Country. They apparently spent over $5 million on advertising just in Iowa, very early in the process.
Okay, early state focus.
Right. Overall, they raised nearly $50 million and spent around $38.9 million specifically supporting Biden or opposing Donald Trump.
Significant sums.
Then there's Priorities USA Action. That's a long-established and influential Democratic super PAC. They raised a massive $139 million and spent over $127 million.
Wow, okay. Major player.
Huge player. Then you had Future Forward USA. They raised $151 million and spent $141.6 million, including a very substantial advertising push late in the primary.
Another big one.
And it's interesting to note, the report mentions Future Forward received significant funding from what are sometimes referred to as dark money groups, nonprofits that don't have to disclose their donors, as well as from prominent tech billionaires like Dustin Moskovitz.
The disclosure issue again. Okay, who else?
American Bridge 21st Century raised $85 million and spent close to $60 million supporting Biden. And even Independence USA PAC.
Wasn't that Bloomberg's group originally?
Exactly. It was originally formed to support Michael Bloomberg's candidacy. It raised $67.7 million. But ultimately, after Bloomberg exited the race, it directed significant funds towards Biden's general election efforts.
Okay, so that's a really substantial amount of independent spending, all kind of pointing towards supporting Biden eventually.
A very significant amount, yes.
What about the other candidates in the primary? Did, say, Sanders or Warren or Buttigieg see similar levels of super PAC activity on their behalf?
Not really, no. The report suggests a clear disparity. Elizabeth Warren did have a super PAC called Persist PAC, which raised $15.4 million.
Okay, $15 million.
Which is, not insignificant, but it's substantially less than the amounts we saw supporting Biden from multiple groups.
Right, compared to Priorities USA or Future Forward, yeah.
Bernie Sanders, well, he has historically been very wary of super PACs, publicly critical of them. And he largely doesn't have significant outside support backing him, though there was some outside money spent opposing him.
Okay. And Buttigieg.
Interestingly, Pete Buttigieg's campaign finance records, at least according to the analysis by Open Secrets cited in the report, don't show any substantial fundraising by independent expenditure groups specifically supporting him during the primary. Although there were some separate reports of spending by a group called Vote Vets.
So relatively little confirmed super PAC support for him then.
Comparatively, yes. So the key takeaway here really is that there was a clear difference, a disparity in the level of super PAC support among the top candidates. And this outside spending likely played a role in amplifying Biden's message, especially at critical junctures in the primary when maybe his own campaign resources were tighter. It adds another layer to the financial picture.
Okay, so we've gotten a good sense of who raised what and through what means the different models, the outside groups. Now, let's turn to the really interesting part, I think. Where did all this money actually go? What were the biggest spending priorities for each of these campaigns?
Right. Examining how they allocated their funds really gives us insight into their core campaign strategies, what they valued most.
Let's break it down.
Okay. As we mentioned earlier, Bloomberg just overwhelmingly prioritized media. Over 67% of his massive spending, think about that, around $754 million went towards advertising.
Just flooding the zone.
Absolutely. That was clearly his strategy. Try and saturate the airwaves, dominate the conversation through paid media.
Okay, what about Biden?
Biden also allocated a very large portion of his spending to media. Nearly 80%, actually, or about $839 million.
Even higher percentage than Bloomberg.
Yes, though that figure does include spending that went into the general election as well, which bumps it up.
Okay. That makes sense.
And it's worth noting, the report mentions he relied heavily on media buying firms to place those ads.
Okay. Sanders and Warren. Did they follow suit on media dominance?
They took a somewhat different approach, more balanced, you could say. Sanders spent about 32% of his funds on media, around $53 million, but also a substantial 27%, or $45.5 million, on salaries.
Salaries, so staff, organizers.
Exactly. It suggests a significant investment in on-the-ground organizing, building that grassroots infrastructure, paying the people doing the work.
Okay, that fits his model. And Warren?
Warren actually devoted the largest share of her spending to salaries, almost 39%, or $50.2 million, with about 30% going to media, $39 million.
Even more emphasis on staff and organization than Sanders.
It appears so, based on these figures. It really indicates a focus on building strong organizational capacity, maybe anticipating a longer primary fight.
Interesting. And Buttigieg?
Buttigieg's spending reflected more of that hybrid approach we talked about earlier. About 40% went to media, around $40.5 million. And a significant 24% was allocated to salaries, about $23.7 million.
So a mix of air cover and ground game.
Seems like it. Trying to balance both media presence and organizational strength.
So you can really see how their different campaign philosophies, their strategies, are reflected in where they chose to invest their money. It's quite clear.
It really is. Bloomberg's strategy was clearly about dominating the airwaves. Sanders and Warren prioritized building that grassroots movement, investing in people. And Buttigieg seemed to be trying to, walk that line between the two.
Right.
And again, just the sheer scale of Bloomberg's media spending is remarkable. It dwarfs the total budgets of some of the other candidates.
Just puts it in perspective.
And the timing of this spending is also really important to consider.
How so?
Well, Bloomberg's spending was heavily concentrated, backloaded, really, in the weeks leading up to Super Tuesday. That was his big bet.
All in on Super Tuesday.
Pretty much. Sanders, Warren, and Buttigieg, on the other hand, all had significant spending earlier in the fourth quarter of 2019 as they geared up for the early primary states like Iowa and New Hampshire.
Investing early.
Right. But this led to what campaign finance watchers call high burn rates, meaning they were spending a large portion of their available funds relatively quickly.
Using up their cash.
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah.
Leaving them with maybe less cash on hand going into the new year. Interestingly, Biden had relatively lower spending in that same Q4 2019 period.
He held back a bit more.
Or perhaps just had less to spend then. There were reports, as we mentioned, that he had relatively low cash reserves heading into South Carolina.
Which is where the super PACs came in again.
Exactly. That's where that super PAC support likely provided crucial air cover, keeping him visible when maybe the campaign itself couldn't afford as much media.
Okay.
Then following his decisive win in South Carolina, His campaign spending saw a dramatic increase. The money flowed in, and it flowed back out into the campaign.
So the timing was key for him.
It really highlights that timing and effectively managing your resources, aligning spending with political opportunities, are critical factors for a campaign. Spending too much too early, or maybe not having the resources available when momentum suddenly shifts your way.
Yeah, that can be fatal.
It can be very detrimental, yes.
This all leads us then to the perhaps million-dollar question or billion-dollar question in Bloomberg's case.
Oh, right.
Did all this money and how it was spent actually translate into success at the ballot box? We saw Bloomberg spend over $1 billion and essentially win just one territory. So how efficient were these campaigns in turning their financial resources into actual votes and delegates?
That's really the core of the analysis, isn't it? And Michael Bloomberg, well, he stands out as the prime example of extreme inefficiency.
Can't really argue with that.
Over $1 billion spent, one only American Samoa. His cost per delegate was just astronomically high. And Tom Steyer, remember him?
Another self-funder, yeah.
He also self-funded his campaign to a significant degree, spent hundreds of millions of dollars, and ultimately won 0 delegates.
0. Wow.
So it really highlights what you might call the Bloomberg paradox, maybe. The clear limitations of trying to simply buy a nomination through overwhelming media saturation.
It proves there's more to it.
So much more. Factors like, candidate appeal, the actual strength of their message, how they perform in debates, the earned media attention they get, key endorsements. All of that plays a vital role that money alone seemingly can't replace.
Okay, so Bloomberg was inefficient. What about Biden?
Joe Biden, in contrast, appears to have been far more efficient with his spending, especially when you look at the trajectory.
How so?
Well, his campaign spent relatively less during that earlier, more competitive phase of the primary. And then his spending surged at the point when he gained significant political momentum after South Carolina.
So the spending aligned with the winning streak.
Exactly, which led to a much more efficient accumulation of delegates per dollar spent during that crucial period.
Okay. And Sanders and Warren.
Sanders and Warren, despite obviously not winning the nomination, also demonstrated greater efficiency in their spending compared to Bloomberg, likely due to the effectiveness of their grassroots mobilization efforts, turning dollars into volunteers and targeted outreach.
Getting more bang for their buck through organization.
Plausibly, yes. And Pete Buttigieg, he showed some early efficiency in Iowa, performing well there relative to his spending. But he seemed to struggle to translate that into broader national support later on, despite spending considerably less overall than Sanders or Warren.
So kind of mixed results for him, efficiency-wise.
A bit mixed, yeah. The overarching conclusion here seems to be that the relationship between campaign spending and electoral success isn't a simple, direct, linear equation. It's not just more money equals more votes.
It's more complicated.
Much more complicated. It's heavily influenced by how and when the money is spent and the broader political context, the mood of the electorate, the media narrative, opponent actions, the whole environment in which the campaign is operating.
And it wasn't just about who ultimately won, was it? The report seems to suggest that the ability to raise money itself served as a really important signal, like a signal of a campaign's viability, and it helped shape the narrative around the different candidates.
Oh, absolutely. That's a crucial point. Fundraising performance is both a resource and a signal.
How did that play out?
Well, strong fundraising numbers early on, like Pete Buttigieg's impressive haul in that second quarter of 2019 we mentioned, or Bernie Sanders' consistent stream of small dollar donations month after month that generated positive media attention.
Right. Candidate X raises a record amount.
Exactly. It reinforced the perception that they were serious contenders, that they had real support. Conversely, weak fundraising reports or campaigns that were spending money too fast and had dwindling cash reserves, think about Warren and Buttigieg late in 2019, or Biden before South Carolina, that could signal potential trouble.
Creates a negative story.
Right. And it could even create a negative feedback loop in terms of media coverage and, importantly, donor confidence. Donors might hesitate to give to a campaign that looks like it's struggling financially.
Makes sense.
And even the source of the funds played a significant role in the narratives. Relying heavily on small dollar donors, as Sanders and Warren did, was often portrayed, rightly or wrongly, as a sign of strong grassroots support, authenticity.
The people-powered campaign narrative.
Precisely. while a greater reliance on large individual contributions, like with Biden and Buttigieg, could sometimes lead to questions or criticisms about a candidate's independence or potential influence from wealthy donors or industries.
The establishment candidate narrative.
Sometimes, yes.
Yeah.
And Bloomberg's almost exclusive self-funding, while demonstrating his immense personal wealth, arguably signaled a certain detachment, maybe, from the traditional party-building process, from needing to persuade donors. It set him apart, but maybe not always in a positive way.
So fundraising numbers weren't just numbers. They were definitely an integral part of the ongoing political story of the primary.
Absolutely integral. Follow the money, follow the narrative sometimes.
So when we look back at Joe Biden's path to victory through this financial lens, then, it wasn't a straightforward story of him just having the most money from day one and dominating financially all the way through.
Not at all. Not by a long shot, actually. It was much more of a story of maybe initial financial adequacy, followed by a period where he faced real financial pressures, and then a significant surge that coincided directly with his political breakthrough.
Survival then surge.
That's a good way to put it. While he had access to those important large donor networks early on, he wasn't the top fundraiser initially. Sanders and Buttigieg had stronger early quarters.
Right.
And as we've discussed, there were reports of lower cash on hand leading up to those crucial early primaries. Financial pressure was real.
And that's where the outside help mattered again.
Very likely. That's where the support from those pro-Biden super PACs, like Unite the Country providing early ad support in Iowa, likely played a really crucial role, providing that early advertising presence when the campaign itself might have been husbanding resources.
Okay.
Then, the victory in South Carolina, that proved to be the absolute turning point.
Everything changed after that.
Everything changed. It generated significant political momentum almost overnight. It led to key endorsements from former rivals consolidating behind him. And that political momentum triggered a massive financial upswing.
The money followed the winds.
It really seemed to.
Yeah.
Donations surged from both small-dollar contributors, who maybe saw him as the viable alternative now, and large-dollar contributors who saw their strategic bet paying off. And then, of course, those pro-Biden super PACs, like Priorities USA and Future Forward, continued their heavy spending into Super Tuesday and beyond.
So, wrapping it up for Biden, it looks like the financial resources largely followed his political success, amplifying it rather than being the primary driver of that initial breakthrough. Is that fair?
I think that's a very fair assessment based on the report's analysis. The political momentum came first, sparked by South Carolina, and the big money followed and helped seal the deal.
Okay, so bringing it all together then, thinking about this whole deep dive into the financial landscape of the 2020 Democratic presidential primary, what are the main sort of key takeaways for our listeners?
Well, I think first and foremost, we've seen pretty clearly that while money is absolutely essential for running a viable campaign, you can't compete without it. It is by no means a guarantee of success.
Right. Exhibit A, Michael Bloomberg.
Exhibit A, B, and C, maybe.
Yeah.
Second, the different fundraising models employed, from the grassroots small-dollar approach to the high-dollar networks and the extreme self-funding, each come with their own distinct strengths, weaknesses, and strategic implications. There's no single right way.
Depends on the candidate and the context.
Exactly. Third, the timing and the efficiency with which a campaign spends its resources are absolutely critical factors, maybe even more important than just the raw total raised.
When and how you spend it matters hugely.
Critically. Fourth, fundraising serves that dual purpose we talked about. It provides the necessary fuel, the resources, but it also acts as a powerful signal of viability, of momentum, shaping the narrative.
It's information as much as it is cash.
In a way, yes. And finally, the influence of outside money, particularly through super PACs, just continues to be a significant and often controversial factor in our electoral processes, even in primaries.
That doesn't seem to be going away.
Not anytime soon, it seems.
And ultimately, then, Joe Biden's path to the nomination wasn't simply about having the most money overall at any given point, but rather about that complex interplay between gaining crucial political momentum at the right time.
Right, that South Carolina moment.
And having the necessary financial resources both within his campaign and, crucially, from his external allies available at those right moments to capitalize on it.
Precisely. It was the convergence of political timing and financial capacity.
Yeah.
And that really leads to a final thought maybe for you, the listener, to consider. Given all these financial dynamics we've explored today, what do these trends suggest about the future of primary elections and, the ongoing, often heated debate surrounding campaign finance regulations? What are the broader implications of these findings for future elections and really the balance of power within political campaigns?
Yeah, how does this shape who can run, who can win, and how campaigns are fought going forward. Definitely a lot to think about there.